Tonight we begin with a disturbing thought, spoken softly, not to alarm you, but to gently open a door in your mind. The oldest maps in the world hint at places that were never meant to be found, and the strangest of them all may point not to gold, not to cities, but to knowledge itself, knowledge deliberately hidden, patiently waiting, breathing quietly in the dark. Tonight, you walk toward the legend of the lost Tartarian library, a place some say never existed, and others say was erased so completely that even doubt was planted in its place. So before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips and give me some encouragement. And as you settle in, I invite you to post your local location and the time you're listening right now, as if leaving a small candle of presence in the world. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. You are standing at the edge of sleep, and also at the edge of a mystery. You do not rush. You never rush with things that matter. Instead, you let the idea drift toward you. What if history is not missing because it was forgotten, but because it was carefully put away? The story begins with a map that should not exist. You imagine it first as parchment, thin and tired, its edges feathered by centuries of careful folding. But the longer you look, the less ordinary it feels. The stars drawn across it are wrong. Not wrong in a childish way, but wrong in a deliberate way, as if they belong to a sky that once existed, or perhaps still exists somewhere beyond the one you know. Rivers bend in unfamiliar directions. Mountain ranges appear where no mountains are recorded. And at the centre, faint but undeniable, is a symbol repeated again and again, like a whispered word written too many times to be coincidence. You feel it before you understand it. This is not a map of land. It is a map of memory. They say the map surfaced briefly in the late 17th century, catalogued for only a few days before vanishing into private hands. Others say it appeared earlier, tucked into the binding of a prayer book or hidden beneath a monastery floor. The details never agree, and perhaps that is the point. Truth, when protected, often learns to wear many disguises. As you trace the map with your imagination, you notice something unsettling. The distances between places do not measure space, but sequence. One location does not lead to another geographically, but logically, like chapters in a book. First this place, then that idea, first a city, then a question, first a river, then a silence. Why would anyone map knowledge this way? You feel the presence of Tartaria now, not as an empire of borders and flags, but as a breath that once moved across continents. Tartaria, as whispered in old atlases, stretched impossibly wide, too wide to be comfortable, too organized to be accidental. And yet, in modern retellings, it dissolves into vagueness, into footnotes, into maybes and margins. How does something so large become so quiet? Perhaps by design. You walk closer to the map, and you notice a detail that sends a gentle chill through you. There is no scale, no legend, no claim of authorship. It does not tell you where it came from, only that it expects you to know how to read it. This is not guidance for the masses. This is an invitation for the patient. You begin to suspect that the lost Tartarian library was never a single building. Or if it was, that was only the final form, the body after the spirit had already spread. The map suggests nodes, points of access, like bookmarks pressed into the world itself. A tower here, a gate there, a well that goes too deep, goes too, a staircase that descends where no basement should be. How many times have you passed such places without noticing? You think of old cities, where foundations predate official records, where stonework is too precise for the tools assigned to its era. You think of buildings repurposed again and again, their original function politely ignored. What if some of them were not designed for people at all, but for books, or for something more fragile than books? The map seems to pulse now, as if responding to your attention. Some believe Tartarian knowledge was alive, or at least treated as such. Knowledge that could decay if exposed too quickly. Knowledge that required rhythm, ceremony, silence. Not consumed, but entered into slowly like water. You ask yourself a quiet question. If such a library existed, what would it contain that was so dangerous, so precious, that erasure seemed kinder than revelation? The answers do not come loudly. They never do. Instead, you sense absence, gaps in what you were taught, sudden starts in timelines, civilizations appearing fully formed, then vanishing without a proper goodbye, technologies arriving too early, philosophies too refined for their supposed age. It feels like reading a book with entire chapters torn out, yet still being told the story makes perfect sense. Does it? The map shows one final detail, barely visible, often overlooked. At the very edge, written so small it might be mistaken for a flaw in the parchment, is a phrase repeated in multiple scripts, multiple languages, some known, some not. The meaning, when translated loosely, is unsettling in its simplicity. What is remembered can be controlled. What is hidden can still grow. You realize then that the lost Tartarian library may not have been hidden to protect the world from knowledge, but to protect knowledge from the world. You imagine scholars who did not rush to publish, engineers who did not seek applause, librarians who did not count visitors. Instead, they counted readiness, calmness, humility. Perhaps they understood something modern humanity has forgotten, that information without wisdom does not enlighten, it overwhelms. Your breathing slows as this thought settles. The map does not tell you where to go yet. It only tells you that the journey will not begin with movement, but with noticing. Noticing patterns in stone. Noticing repeated symbols that architects claim are decorative. Noticing songs sung to children that contain directions disguised as comfort. And most of all, noticing how often history insists that nothing important is missing. You feel a strange certainty now, gentle but firm. If the lost Tartarian library ever existed, it was never destroyed. Destruction is loud. This disappearance is too quiet, too clean, too polite. No, this feels like shelving, like closing a book carefully, knowing it will be opened again when the reader is ready. The map fades from your imagination, but its shape remains, like an after-image behind your eyes. You know this is only the first step. A glance, not an entry, a whisper, not a voice, and as sleep begins to lean closer you sense that somewhere, beneath stone and soil and centuries of forgetting, something vast and patient is still arranged in order, waiting not for discovery, but for recognition. You do not wake suddenly from the map. Instead, you drift forward, as if carried by a slow current, and the next realization arrives with a quiet shock. If a library of this scale ever existed, its doors would not look like doors at all. They would be hidden in plain sight, dressed as ordinary things disguised as usefulness, familiarity, or neglect. That is how you begin to notice them. Tonight, you walk through places you have always known, streets you have crossed without counting your steps, buildings you have trusted simply because they have always been there. And yet once the idea takes root, once the map's logic begins to rearrange your attention, these places change. Not dramatically, not suddenly. They change the way a face changes when you finally see the resemblance to an ancestor. You notice the symbols first. They are not obvious markings carved by rebels or secret societies craving attention. No, these symbols are polite, modest. They sit at eye level or just above it, worked into stone trim, iron railings, cornerstones. Spirals that never quite close, squares nested within circles. Repeated floral motifs that feel less decorative and more deliberate, like punctuation marks in a forgotten language. You pause before an old building, perhaps a courthouse, perhaps a library, perhaps something renamed so many times its original purpose has blurred. The sign tells you what it is now, but the stone tells you what it was meant to be. The entrance arches are taller than necessary. The doors are heavy, built not just to keep weather out but sound in. And above them, centered and calm, is a symbol you recognize from the map. Your heart does not race. This is not fear, it is recognition. They say Tartarian architecture was never about beauty alone. Beauty was simply the side effect of alignment. Proportions mattered, materials mattered, orientation mattered. Buildings were instruments tuned to something unseen. Some whispered of resonance, others of memory. A few dared to suggest consciousness itself responded differently within certain geometries. What if the doors to the lost Tartarian library were never locked, only misread? You step inside, not physically, but in imagination, letting the space speak. High ceilings pull your thoughts upward. Floors feel unusually solid beneath your feet, as if layered more thickly than required. The air is cooler, quieter, even when voices echo. And somewhere, always somewhere, there is a stairwell that descends when you expect it to rise, or rises when you expect it to descend. These are not accidents. You remember the map's logic now. Sequence, not distance. Notice, not travel. The door does not open because you arrive. It opens because you see. You think of train stations built like cathedrals, of exhibition halls that resemble temples, of old schools that feel more like monasteries. Why did so many 19th century public buildings carry the gravity of sacred spaces? Why were places of transit and administration designed with such reverence, such ritual? Perhaps because they were never meant to be only what they became. The stories say Tartarian librarians hid access points within functions that could survive regime changes. Governments rise and fall, religions split and merge, but a post office remains a post office, a courthouse remains a courthouse, a museum remains a museum. Purpose is the perfect camouflage. You walk past a wall and feel it again, that subtle wrongness. A panel that sounds hollow when tapped. A pattern in the tiles that repeats every seventh step. A door too small to be useful, too solid to be fake. You're not meant to open it with your hands. You're meant to pass it until you no longer feel the urge to ask what lies beyond. But tonight, you do ask. And that makes all the difference. The legend says there were many doors, not one. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, scattered across continents. Some opened downward, some sideways, some inward. Some did not open at all, but listened. They listened for patterns in human behaviour, for cycles of curiosity and restraint. The door did not judge intelligence. It measured something softer, something rarer. Patience. You realise now why so many seekers failed. They dug where there was nothing. They dynamited mountains. They drained lakes. They searched loudly, aggressively, as if truth were prey to be cornered. But the Tartarian doors responded only to those who could sit with uncertainty, who could walk past mystery without demanding it perform. You recall old photographs of grand buildings being demolished, their stones repurposed, their blueprints lost. How many doors were sealed not by locks, but by renovation? How many stairways were filled with concrete, not to hide something sinister, but to preserve it from a world growing too impatient? The doors did not vanish. They were put to sleep. You stand before another one now, this time unmistakable. A narrow archway behind a staircase. It leads nowhere useful. It is too shallow to be a room, too deep to be decorative. And etched faintly along its inner curve is the same symbol from the map, worn almost smooth by time. You do not touch it. Somehow you know better. Instead, you breathe. Slowly, evenly. You let your thoughts settle, like dust in still air. And in that quiet, you feel something subtle shift, not the door, you. The legend suggests the lost Tartarian library was not accessed by force, nor even by intention, but by alignment. When your inner rhythm matched the rhythm of the place, passages revealed themselves, not physically at first, but perceptually. A sense of depth where there was none, a pull where there was only stone. You wonder briefly how many children stumbled close to these doors. Children notice patterns adults ignore. Children hum when they walk, tap walls, count steps. How many were gently redirected, told not to linger, told not to daydream? How many almost found it? The door remains closed, but it no longer feels sealed. It feels like a held breath. You step away, understanding that this is not the moment. The map never promised immediacy. It promised a path, and paths unfold one step at a time, often backward, often sideways, often disguised as ordinary days. As you continue your quiet walk through the world, you begin to see doors everywhere. Not literal ones, though those exist, but conceptual ones. Moments when a question could have been asked but wasn't. Stories that end just before explanation. Lessons that teach how, but never why. Perhaps the greatest door was placed in history itself. You think of Tartaria again, of how it faded not with fire and screams, but with redrawing and renaming. Borders adjusted, maps updated, words softened. An empire dissolved into a suggestion, then into a curiosity, then into a joke. What better way to lock a door than to convince everyone it was never there? The door in plain sight does not resist you. It waits for you to outgrow the need to push. As your breathing deepens, as sleep begins to lean more heavily against your thoughts, you feel a strange comfort in this. The knowledge that something vast and ordered still exists beneath the noise of the world. Something that does not demand belief, only readiness. The door does not open tonight. And that is exactly how you know you're getting closer. You begin to understand that a library is not defined only by what it contains, but by what is missing. The absence itself becomes a kind of evidence, quiet but persuasive, like a gap in a melody where a note should be. And as you drift deeper into the legend of the lost Tartarian library, the next thing that reveals itself is not a room, not a door, but a rumour, soft, persistent, and unsettling. They called it the burned catalogue. Not a single book, but a list, an index, a careful accounting of what once existed and where it could be found. According to the whispers, every Tartarian knowledge house maintained such a catalogue, copied by hand, updated by ritual, never stored in the same place twice. It did not contain the knowledge itself. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, it described the paths, the shelves, the sequences. It told you which door led to which chamber required which state of mind. And then, one by one, the catalogues disappeared. You hear the stories as if overheard through walls, monasteries that burned without spreading to nearby buildings, archives lost to accidental fires that somehow consumed only certain rooms, librarians who refused to evacuate during disasters, later found seated calmly among ash, their bodies untouched, their desks empty. Why protect a list more fiercely than the books themselves? You sit with that question, letting it turn slowly, like a key not yet ready to be used. The legend says the burned catalogue was dangerous because it could be read by anyone. Unlike the library doors, which required patience and alignment, the catalogue reduced mystery to instruction. It made the hidden reachable by the hurried. And in a world growing louder, faster, more ambitious, that was unacceptable. You imagine the moment of decision. Not panic, not violence. A meeting, perhaps, held in whispers and candlelight. Elder librarians, engineers, map keepers, singers of coded songs. They would have understood something painful. The knowledge they protected had outgrown its era. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too easily misunderstood. So they chose fire. Not the wild kind, not the destructive blaze of conquest, but controlled burning, ritualized, selective. Fire as a razor, not weapon. Fire as a way to let go without revealing where the letting go occurred. You realize now why so many historical fires are described with the same strange language. Cause unknown. No clear origin. Contained quickly. Fires that behaved politely. Fires that consumed paper but spared stone. Fires that left surrounding structures untouched, as if obeying instructions. The catalogue, it is said, was burned in fragments across decades. No single blaze, no single location. Each fragment destroyed only after the corresponding door had been sealed, or lulled, or redirected into something harmless. A staircase turned into a wall, a chamber turned into a storage room, a vault turned into a rumour, and yet, not all of it burned. There is always someone who hesitates, always a hand that trembles just long enough, always a librarian who believes that one day the world might soften again. You feel that hesitation now, like a faint warmth against your palm. They say a partial catalogue survived, not in one piece, not even in one language. Pieces scattered like seeds, margins of other books, children's alphabets, funeral inscriptions, even lullabies, soft lists disguised as comfort, teaching order without explanation. You wonder how many times you have brushed past such fragments, how many times you have read a line that felt out of place, unnecessary, oddly specific. Why did a nursery rhyme mention 7 steps, then 3 turns, then silence? Why did an old church hymn describe a door that sings only when no one listens? You begin to see the pattern. The people who burned the catalogue did not want the library forgotten. They wanted it slowed. They wanted access to require synthesis, intuition, humility. They wanted seekers to become participants, not consumers. That decision came at a cost. You sense the weight of it now, the guilt, the quiet mourning. When you burn a map, you do not just lose destinations, you lose the stories of those who are walking toward them. Generations after Tartaria would feel this loss as confusion, as fragmentation, as the sense that something important had been misplaced, though no one could agree on what. History, you realize, has been grieving without knowing why. The rumour continues. It speaks of those who tried to save the catalogue, who smuggled pieces away at great personal risk. Not heroes in the dramatic sense. No swords, no battles, just people who copied one line too many, memorized one sequence too well, refused to forget entirely. Most of them died quietly. Records show librarians who left no descendants, scholars who vanished from correspondence, monks whose names appear once, then never again. Their deaths were not announced as executions, they were absorbed into normality, illness, travel, accidents. The most effective way to erase a person is to let them fade without spectacle. And yet something of them remains. You feel it when you hold an old book and sense a strange order to its margins. You feel it when a building seems to invite silence instead of speech. You feel it when a story ends too soon, leaving you with a question that does not hurt, but hums. The burned catalogue is not gone. It has been transformed into instinct. You ask yourself something gently dangerous. If the catalogue still exists in fragments, what would happen if someone reassembled it? Would the doors wake all at once? Would the library breathe again, suddenly and uncontrollably? Or would it simply continue as it always has, opening only to those who no longer need instruction? The legend offers no answer. It never does. Instead, it gives you a warning tucked inside a contradiction. The catalogue was burned to protect the world from knowledge, but it was also burned to protect knowledge from the world. Fire, after all, cleans in both directions. As your thoughts slow, as the idea of burning softens from destruction into preservation, you begin to feel less urgency, less hunger to know everything at once. Perhaps that is the first lesson the Lost Tartarian Library ever taught. Not everything that disappears is lost. Some things are simply waiting to be remembered in a different way. And somewhere, in ash that never quite cooled, a list still exists. Not written, not certain, but a sense of sequence. A knowing of when not to proceed. You carry that feeling with you now, like a coal wrapped carefully in cloth, warm but not dangerous, as sleep drifts closer and the next whisper prepares to surface. As the idea of the burned catalogue settles, something subtler begins to emerge, like a figure seen only in peripheral vision. Every great library, you know, requires a caretaker. Not an owner, not a ruler, but someone who listens more than they speak, who remembers more than they record. And in the legend of the Lost Tartarian Library, that presence condenses into a single, persistent whisper. They call this figure the librarian without a name. You do not encounter this librarian in records or portraits. There are no confirmed dates, no birthplace, no lineage. Instead, the librarian appears in dreams, in marginal notes, in second-hand recollections that always begin the same way. I was guided by someone, but I can't quite remember who. You feel an unexpected calm as you consider this. A nameless guide is harder to misuse. A face without an identity cannot be turned into a symbol, a banner, or a threat. The legend says the librarian never aged, or perhaps aged so slowly that time learned to ignore them. Witnesses across centuries describe the same presence, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes neither, always gentle, always unhurried. Clothed plainly, speaking little, moving through spaces as if already familiar with their future. You wonder if the librarian was a single person at all. What if librarian was a role that moved from body to body, like a flame passed from candle to candle? Or what if it was something less physical, a cultivated state of awareness, learned and then inhabited? Tartarian knowledge, after all, did not separate mind, environment, and function. Everything was a system, everything was shared. You imagine the librarian walking the hidden stacks, not shelves of wood and paper alone, but sequences of rooms, resonant chambers, memory halls designed to be walked rather than read. The librarian would not explain. Explanation fixes meaning too quickly. Instead, they would pause, gesture, wait. Waiting was their language. Many seekers, the stories say, failed this test. They demanded answers. They asked for proof. They wanted to see the most powerful texts first. The librarian would simply stop walking, not in refusal, but in stillness. And eventually those seekers would turn back, convinced nothing had happened. Others stayed. Those who stayed often reported strange dreams afterward. Dreams of vast halls filled with soft light, of books that opened themselves, of voices that felt both ancient and intimate. They woke knowing less than they wanted, but more than they expected. You feel a question forming, slow and careful. Why guide anyone at all if the knowledge was meant to be hidden? The answer arrives not as a sentence, but as a feeling. The library was never meant to be secret forever. It was meant to survive the wrong moment. And survival sometimes requires retreat, not sequence, but selectivity. The librarian appeared most often during periods of upheaval, after wars, during collapses, in the quiet decades before major cultural shifts. Almost as if the library sensed imbalance and extended a hand, not to fix the world, but to prepare a few minds to carry something forward. You recall accounts of artists, architects, and philosophers who seemed to leap ahead of their time, producing work that felt complete upon arrival, as if remembered rather than invented. Some later claimed to have been shown something, though they could not describe by whom. Could they have met the librarian? You imagine being led through a space where sound behaves strangely, footsteps muted, breathing amplified. The librarian would not point to shelves. Instead, they would ask you to stand somewhere specific, to listen, to wait. And in that waiting, understanding would begin to assemble itself piece by piece without strain. No names were given because names fix stories in place. And the Tartarian library above all resisted fixation. It wanted to remain fluid, adaptive, alive. You sense now why the librarian was never recorded officially. Writing a name would invite pursuit. Drawing a face would invite imitation. Power structures would attempt to claim, to weaponize, to command. A nameless presence cannot be subpoenaed, imprisoned, or crowned. The librarian's greatest act, according to the Whispers, came during the burning of the catalogue. While others destroyed lists and sealed passages, the librarian did something quieter. They taught a handful of people how to forget on purpose. Not erase, forget. There is a difference. Forgetting in this sense was a skill, a way of loosening information from urgency, of storing it in intuition rather than memory. Those who learned this could walk away carrying knowledge that could not be extracted under pressure, because it no longer existed in a linear form. You feel the elegance of this solution. No torture, no coercion, no threat could retrieve what had been dissolved into instinct and rhythm. The librarian did not disappear after this. They simply became harder to notice, less frequent. Appearing now not in physical spaces, but in moments of alignment, in the calm certainty that sometimes arises without explanation, in the feeling of being gently redirected away from a question you are not yet ready to ask. As you drift deeper into the story, you wonder if the librarian is guiding you now, not by giving answers, but by pacing the journey, by ensuring each idea arrives only when the previous one has settled. If so, they are doing their job well. You feel no rush, no hunger, only a slow, steady curiosity wrapped in reassurance. The librarian without name does not demand belief. They do not promise revelation. They simply walk ahead, leaving space for you to follow, or not. And that freedom, you realize, may be the most guarded knowledge of all. You begin to sense that not all books wish to be finished. Some resist completion the way a tide resists being held in the hand. And as the presence of the nameless librarian fades gently into the background, another room arises to meet you, one that feels almost intimate, almost alive. They call it the ink that refuses to dry. At first, the idea sounds poetic, the kind of embellishment stories gather over time, but the more you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. Ink that never dries is not unfinished. It is active. It suggests a text, still in conversation with the reader, still responding, still changing. According to the legend, certain volumes within the Lost Tartarian library were not written once, but continuously. Their words were not fixed statements, but living processes, adjusting subtly to the mind that encountered them. When untouched, the pages appeared blank or faintly marked, like breath on glass. Only when approached with calm attention did the ink darken, forming sentences that felt both ancient and immediate. You imagine holding such a book. It would be warm, not with heat but with presence. The ink would glisten slightly, as if freshly laid down, yet never smear. No matter how long the book remained open, the words would not dry into certainty. They would remain flexible, open-ended, like questions that refused to be closed. Why would Tartarian knowledge take such a form? The answer drifts toward you slowly. Permanence can be a kind of violence. Fixed words invite fixed interpretations, and fixed interpretations harden into dogma, then into law, then into weapons. The Tartarians, it is said, understood this early. They designed their most sensitive knowledge to remain incomplete so it could not be extracted, copied, or enforced. The ink that refuses to dry cannot be quoted accurately. It cannot be photographed reliably. It cannot be removed from its context without losing meaning. In this way, the knowledge protected itself. You recall how modern screens refresh constantly, how data streams update in real time, and for a moment the distance between ancient Tartaria and the present narrows uncomfortably. What if some technologies we believe to be new are echoes, clumsy rediscoveries of much older principles? The stories say these living texts were often consulted during times of uncertainty, not to predict outcomes, but to clarify states of mind. A seeker might ask about war, and the book would respond not with strategies, but with passages about fear, pride, and impatience. Another might ask about the future of humanity, and find only reflections on cooperation, restraint, and timing. The book did not answer the question asked, it answered the question beneath it. You understand now why these volumes could never leave the library. Removed from the resonant chambers, from the quiet geometry and tuned materials, the ink would fade, the words would dissolve back into suggestion, the book would become ordinary, inert, safe. Some say this is why a few Tartarian books ended up at private collections yet revealed nothing. Collectors complained they were blank, fraudulent, or damaged. The truth was gentler and stranger. The books refused to speak outside their intended environment. You feel a quiet respect for this design, knowledge that knows when to remain silent. The nameless librarian you suspect was trained to read these texts without forcing them, to stand, breathe, wait, to allow meaning to emerge rather than be seized. Impatience, according to the legend, caused the ink to thin, to blur, to retreat. Only those who could sit with ambiguity long enough were rewarded with clarity, and even then, clarity that felt provisional, never final. You begin to wonder how many modern frustrations come from demanding dryness too quickly, from wanting conclusions instead of processes, from insisting that truth stands still long enough to be labelled. The ink that refuses to dry offers a different philosophy, one where understanding is not something you possess, but something you participate in. As your breathing slows, as the rhythm of the story becomes more like a tide than a path, you imagine the library halls again. Soft light, gentle echoes, books that seem to watch you as much as you watch them. Somewhere among them, pages remain open, ink still glistening, patiently waiting for a reader who knows how to linger without grasping. And you sense without urgency that one day, perhaps not tonight, perhaps not in this lifetime, those pages will recognize you. You begin to notice that the library, as it reveals itself piece by piece, does not rely on sight alone. Vision, after all, can be fooled. Words can be erased. Symbols can be misread. But vibration remembers. And this is how the next legend finds you softly through your feet rather than your eyes. They are called the singing floor stones. At first, the phrase feels harmless, almost whimsical, but as you listen more closely to the stories, a deeper unease settles in. These were not stones that sang for pleasure or performance. They sang for function, for access, for alignment. According to the whispers, certain chambers of the lost Tartarian library were paved with stone slabs cut to precise thicknesses, laid in deliberate sequences. When stepped upon in the correct order, they produced tones, low, steady hums that travelled through the body rather than the air. Not melodies, but conformations. Not music, but keys. You imagine entering such a space. The ceiling would be high, but not echoing. Sound would behave strangely here, folding inward instead of bouncing back. Each step would feel heavier than expected, as if the floor were asking a question with every footfall. Stepping correctly and nothing happens. Step correctly and the stone responds, vibrating gently, like a deep breath taken by the building itself. Why build knowledge this way? Because sound cannot be carried away easily. Because vibration requires presence. Because you cannot hum your way through a space while distracted. The singing floor stones demanded attention, balance, patience. They punished haste not with traps or alarms, but with silence. You think now of old cathedrals, mosques, and temples whose acoustics feel almost intentional, as if prayer itself were part of the architecture. You think of standing stones, of amphitheatres, of places where a whisper travels impossibly far. What if these were not spiritual accidents, but fragments of a much older acoustic science? Tartarian builders, the legend suggests, understood resonance deeply. They knew that stone, when shaped correctly, could store and transmit information, not as data, but as state. Calmness could be reinforced, agitation could be dampened, certain emotional frequencies could be encouraged or quieted. The library did not want anxious readers. The singing floor stones were often the final threshold before sensitive chambers. No door, no guard, only a requirement: walk slowly enough to hear yourself think. Those who rushed across felt nothing and turned back, convinced the stories were exaggerations. Those who lingered, who adjusted their pace instinctively, began to feel the hum rising through their legs, their spine, their breath. Some described it as being tuned. You wonder how many modern buildings leave you feeling unsettled without explanation. How many spaces drain you while others restore you. Perhaps we still respond to architecture in ways we no longer understand, like instruments reacting to forgotten hands. The legend warns that the floor stones could also mislead. A false sequence followed confidently would produce a pleasant hum but led nowhere. Tartarian designers knew that certainty without awareness was just another kind of blindness. The stones tested not only memory, but humility. Were you listening to the space or only to yourself? You pause on this thought, letting it settle. The singing floor stones were never mapped in the burned catalogue. Their sequences changed subtly over time, responding to shifts in the environment, the structure, even the people who walked them most often. Knowledge here was not static. It breathed with the world. This made the library resilient. Even if a path were discovered once, it could not be exploited forever. The stones would adapt, the hum would soften or sharpen, the correct rhythm would shift, just enough to demand renewed attention. As your mind drifts, you imagine standing barefoot on cool stone, feeling the faint vibration rise and fall. Each step a question, each pause an answer. There is no rush. The stones are patient. They have waited centuries already. You realize now that the lost Tartarian library did not protect itself through secrecy alone. It protected itself through participation. It asked something of every seeker. Not loyalty, not belief, but presence. And presence, you sense, is becoming rare. As sleep draws closer, the idea of the singing floor stones begins to feel less like a legend, and more like a memory you cannot place. A sensation of knowing where to step without knowing why. A moment when the ground itself seemed to guide you. Perhaps you have already walked such a path, perhaps you simply did not know to listen. As the echo of the singing floor stones fades into your body, you realize something important. The Tartarian library did not rely on silence alone. It also relied on sound, but not the kind meant to be noticed. The next trail of clues does not lead you into ruins or underground halls. It drifts toward you on a tune so familiar you almost overlook it. These are the letters hidden in lullabies. You have heard them before, perhaps sung softly at night, perhaps half remembered from childhood, simple melodies, repetitive words, phrases that seem innocent, even nonsensical. And yet the legend suggests these songs were never meant to explain anything. They were meant to preserve order. In cultures scattered across continents, you find the same strange patterns. Songs that count steps without saying why. Verses that turn left, then right, then pause. Lyrics that repeat numbers in odd sequences, 3, 7, 12 numbers that appear again and again in Tartarian architecture and resonance chambers. You ask yourself a quiet question. Why hide directions in children's songs? Because children remember without trying. Because melodies slip past fear and suspicion. Because a tune, once learned, can survive centuries without ink, without shelves, without walls. The Tartarians understood something fundamental about memory. What is sung lodges deeper than what is taught. What is whispered before sleep bypasses resistance. And so, when the catalogue was burned and the doors were sealed, the most important sequences were not written down again. They were sung, not loudly, not formally, gently. You imagine a mother humming while rocking a child, a grandmother singing while kneading dough, a caretaker calming a restless mind, each repetition a subtle reinforcement, each verse a fragment of a path. No one knew they were carrying instructions, and that ignorance was the protection. The songs did not name places. They described sensations, cold stone, turning corners, waiting in silence, feeling a hum beneath the feet. These were not maps for the intellect. They were rehearsals for the body. You think now of how certain songs make you feel safe without explanation, how others make you restless, how rhythm can guide movement even when meaning is unclear. Tartarian knowledge did not separate learning from comfort. It wove them together. The legend says the librarian without a name helped seed these songs, travelling quietly, listening more than speaking, adjusting verses slightly from place to place so no single version contained the whole path. Only by overlapping traditions could a fuller sequence be sensed. This made the knowledge communal, not centralized, and remarkably resilient. Empires collapsed, borders shifted, languages evolved, yet the songs remained, altered, simplified, sometimes mocked as childish or meaningless, but never erased entirely. Even now you can hear echoes if you listen closely. You hum one of these tunes in your mind and something stirs. A sense of direction that does not belong to any landscape you know. A memory that feels inherited rather than personal. What if bedtime itself was part of the system? A mind on the edge of sleep is more open, less defended. It drifts. It connects. The Tartarians may have understood that the best way to pass on sensitive knowledge was not through schools or scrolls, but through the quiet rituals of care. You feel the tenderness of this now, knowledge passed not through authority but through love. The songs were never meant to be decoded all at once. Doing so would flatten them into instructions, stripping away their protective ambiguity. Instead, they were meant to awaken recognition when the body encountered the right space. A turn would feel familiar, a pause would feel natural, the song would complete itself without conscious effort. Some seekers, the stories say, reached a door or chamber and suddenly remembered a tune they had not thought of in decades. The rhythm guided their steps, the lyrics slowed their breath. The space responded, the library recognized the song. You let that idea rest gently, a library that listens, a building that remembers voices. As your thoughts soften, you wonder how many answers humanity has already been given, disguised as comfort, hidden in moments of care, overlooked because they seem too simple to matter. Perhaps the lost Tartarian library was never trying to hide from us. Perhaps it was trying to resolve slowly enough to meet it. The tune fades now, looping quietly like a cradle rocking back and forth. You do not need to finish it. It will finish itself, in time. The lullabies do not end. They soften, slow and then invert as if turning themselves inside out. And in that inversion, you encounter the next layer of the legend. One that speaks not in melody, but in reflection. This is the mirror script warning. You are told that deep within certain Tartarian chambers, the writing on the walls cannot be read directly. When faced head-on, it appears distorted, meaningless, or reversed. Letters bend the wrong way, words collapse into shapes. Only when seen indirectly, reflected in polished stone, water, or metal, does the script resolve into clarity. At first, this sounds like another clever trick, but the more you think about it, the more it feels like a philosophy. The Tartarians, it is said, believed that truth approached directly becomes distorted by desire. The more urgently you stare at it, the more it resists. But when you allow it to appear sideways, gently, without force, it reveals itself intact. You imagine standing in a narrow corridor, walls etched with backward text. You strain to read it, and the effort tightens your chest. The words refuse you. Then, almost by accident, you catch them reflected faintly in a brass fixture or a still pool of water at your feet. Suddenly, without effort, they make sense. The warning reads not as prohibition, but as reminder. What you chase will turn away, what you allow will turn toward you. You feel the weight of that sentence settle slowly. The mirror script was used for the most dangerous truths, not because they were evil, but because they were easily misused. Origins of humanity, the nature of consciousness, the mechanics of influence. Read too directly, these ideas could inflate ego, justify domination, fracture societies. So the Tartarians built friction into understanding. You think now of how many modern debates collapse because participants stare straight at conclusions instead of reflecting on assumptions. How certainty hardens when questioned directly. How defensiveness melts only when approached obliquely. The mirror script did not hide meaning. It changed posture. Only those willing to look without grasping could read it. Only those comfortable with indirection could proceed. Some accounts claim the script was alive in its own way, subtly adjusting reflection angles as a reader's state of mind shifted. Agitation blurred the text. Calmness sharpened it. The walls, like the ink that refused to dry, responded to inner conditions. This makes you wonder, what if the library itself was a teacher, not a container? A teacher that never spoke, never explained, but structured experience so insight emerged naturally, or not at all. You recall ancient sayings that warn against naming the ultimate truth, against staring too long at the sun. Perhaps these were not metaphors, but instructions born from similar systems. The mirror script also served another function. It prevented copying. You cannot easily transcribe reverse text from a reflection. Any attempt to do so introduces errors. Each generation's version drifts slightly, ensuring no single fixed doctrine survives. Again, resilience through imperfection. You imagine frustrated scholars turning away, declaring the inscriptions meaningless, decorative, or symbolic nonsense. How convenient, how safe. Meanwhile, those who lingered, who experimented with angles and light, who relaxed into the space rather than conquering it, carried something away, not notes, but understanding. As sleep draws closer, you feel less inclined to chase answers yourself. The story has slowed your curiosity into something rounder, softer. You begin to trust that meaning will surface when needed, and not before. Perhaps this is the greatest warning the mirror script ever offered. Truth is not withheld as punishment. It is withheld as protection. Protection from misuse, protection from arrogance, protection from premature certainty. The reflections dim now, the text dissolves back into shapes and shadows, and you are left not with instructions, but with a posture, a way of approaching the unknown without violence. That, you sense, was always the point. When the mirror script fades, it does not leave you in darkness, it leaves you in depth. A sense that what you have been walking through so far, maps, doors, songs, reflections, has all been surface preparation. Because now the legend asks you to descend. This is where you hear of the city beneath the city. Not a myth of collapse or catastrophe, but of layering. The Tartarians, it is said, did not abandon their knowledge when the time turned against them. They folded it downward into spaces already forgotten, already ignored. Beneath streets that grew loud, beneath markets, homes and monuments, beneath history itself. You imagine standing on a familiar street, cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Beneath them, another street, and beneath that, another still. Each older, quieter, more deliberate. Cities stacked like pages in a book never fully closed. Archaeologists sometimes uncover these layers accidentally. Basements that reveal arches too grand for storage. Tunnels that align too perfectly to be random. Rooms with no clear function, sealed not in haste but with care. Official explanations call them repurposed infrastructure, storm drains, forgotten cellars. But the legend whispers something else. It says the lower you go, the more ordered things become. Above ground, chaos, noise, change. Below, symmetry, rhythm, purpose. The city beneath the city was not a refuge for people, but for ideas. Knowledge needed quiet. It needed insulation from politics, from fashion, from fear. You feel the temperature drop as you imagine descending stone steps worn shallow by feet that moved slowly, respectfully. Light changes here. Not darkness exactly, but a softer glow, reflected and recycled. Sound thickens, as if wrapped in cloth. The Tartarians understood that memory behaves differently underground. Time stretches, urgency loosens. Perhaps this is why so many ancient traditions associate wisdom with caves, wells, roots, and underworlds. Going down was never about death, it was about depth. You walk through corridors that feel more like aisles, pillars spaced like punctuation, doors recessed into walls, not marked by signs but by proportions you somehow recognize. You do not feel lost, you feel arranged. The city beneath the city was designed to be walked, not navigated. To be felt, not mapped. Its layout mirrored mental processes, reflection, association, pause. This was not a place for crowds, it was a place for calibration. Some accounts claim entire neighborhoods were built atop these spaces intentionally to disguise and protect them. A bakery above a memory hall, a courthouse above a resonance chamber. Daily life as camouflage. You wonder how many people have lived full lives directly above such places, never knowing. How many arguments, celebrations, and ordinary moments unfolded over shelves of knowledge, still patiently aligned. The legend says the deepest layers were never breached. Not by invaders, not by excavators, not even by accident. They were positioned where no practical reason would ever send a drill. Why dig deeper when the surface seems sufficient? And yet here you are, descending in an imagination, step by slow step. You begin to suspect that the lost Tartarian library was never destroyed because it was never centralized. It was distributed vertically, like roots beneath a forest. Cut one, and others survive. Forget the tree, and the soil still remembers. As your breathing deepens, the idea of depth becomes comforting rather than ominous. Down is quiet, down is stable, Down is where foundations wait. You do not reach the bottom tonight. No one ever does. But you sense it below you. Order, patience, shelves of silence, stretching farther than history admits. And for the first time you understand why so much of the modern world feels unbalanced. It is built too far from its roots. As you linger at the edge of the lower city, another presence becomes apparent. Not a structure, not a mechanism, but a quiet continuity. Knowledge, you realize, does not guard itself alone. It is watched. Not aggressively, not possessively, simply faithfully. These are the custodians of dust and oaths. They do not appear in uniforms or robes. There are no insignias, no ranks, no names passed down publicly. If you passed one on the street, you would never know, and that is precisely the point. The Tartarian custodians were never meant to stand apart from the world, they were meant to dissolve into it. The legend describes them as listeners rather than watchers. Their task was not to prevent entry, but to sense readiness. They did not guard doors with weapons, they guarded thresholds with patience. You imagine a custodian sweeping a floor that never seems dirty. Dust here is not a neglect. It is a measure of time passing undisturbed. To disturb dust without purpose was considered rude, even dangerous. Dust was a signal. It meant a space was resting. The custodians learned to read dust the way others read faces. Footprints told stories. Air movement mattered. A chamber disturbed too often would be gently redirected, its access softened or obscured. Not closed, never closed, but guided away from attention until the imbalance passed. And the oaths? They were not sworn aloud. The Tartarian oath, according to the whispers, was an agreement with forgetting. Custodians did not promise to remember everything. They promised to remember only when necessary. They trained themselves to release details back into the environment, storing knowledge in relationships rather than in mind alone. This made them remarkably difficult to interrogate. You could not extract a map from a custodian because no map existed in a single place. You could not force a confession because there was nothing fixed to confess. Knowledge lived in motion, in habits, in timing, in the subtle redirection of events. A custodian might forget a passage deliberately for years, only to recall it instantly when the conditions aligned. This was not weakness, it was discipline. You feel the calm strength of this system now, no secrecy fueled by fear, no guarding driven by power, only stewardship shaped by restraint. The custodians often lived ordinary lives. Bakers, surveyors, teachers. Their work above ground was never accidental. Each role placed them near certain access points, certain rhythms of traffic, certain flows of attention. They did not block curiosity, they diluted it. When necessary, they intervened gently. A permit delayed, a staircase renovated. A rumour reframed as folklore. Nothing dramatic, nothing traceable. History moved on, unaware it had been nudged. Some custodians, it is said, were not even aware of the full scope of their role. They were trained in fragments, just enough to maintain balance locally. This decentralization ensured the system could not collapse all at once. You consider how different this feels from modern institutions, which crave visibility, control, permanence. The Tartarian custodians understood impermanence as strength. As sleep begins to press more firmly against your thoughts, you sense these custodians not as figures of authority but as gardeners, tending silence, pruning access, trusting that what is meant to emerge will do so naturally without force. Perhaps they are still here. Perhaps you have met one and never known. And perhaps that too is working exactly as intended. The custodians fade back into the quiet patterns of ordinary life, and in their place something vast begins to unfold above you. Not overhead in the physical sense, but overhead in imagination. Because the next chamber of the legend does not lie underground at all. It opens upward into questions that stretch far beyond stone and soil. This is where you encounter the Atlas of Impossible Skies. You're told it was not a single book, but a collection of charts, star maps, sky cycles, diagrams of light and shadow, carefully preserved within the deepest reaches of the lost Tartarian library. At first glance, they resemble astronomical records, constellations, planetary paths, eclipses carefully marked. But the longer one studies them, the more unsettling they become. The stars do not match the sky you know. Some constellations appear rotated, others are missing entirely. New ones emerge where modern astronomy sees nothing. The charts seem to describe a sky from a different time or a different perspective. And yet they are rendered with such precision, such confidence that doubt begins to soften into curiosity. You feel it now, the gentle unease of realizing the heavens may not be as fixed as you were taught. The Tartarians, according to the whispers, did not see the sky as a static backdrop. They saw it as a clock, a mirror, and a map. All at once, the atlas of impossible skies tracked not only celestial movement, but changes in perception itself. It recorded how the sky appeared from different states of consciousness, different atmospheric conditions, even different eras of human awareness. What if the stars shift not only because they move, but because we do? You imagine a reader standing beneath a domed chamber, charts spread across a stone table. Above, an oculus reveals the night sky. The reader compares chart to reality, then pauses. Something does not align. The sky overhead seems subtly altered by the act of observation itself. The atlas suggests that humanity once perceived the heavens differently, not because the stars were elsewhere, but because the mind interpreting them operated under different assumptions, different limits, different agreements about what was possible. Some charts depict skies during great silences, periods when human activity dwindled, when noise fell away. Others correspond to eras of expansion, exploration, and unrest. The implication is gentle but profound. The sky we see may be shaped in part by how we live beneath it. You think of ancient myths describing it when the gods walked closer, when the sky felt nearer, heavier with meaning. Were these metaphors, or memories? The atlas of impossible skies was considered dangerous not because it predicted catastrophes, but because it destabilized certainty. It suggested that reality itself might be participatory, that observation and belief subtly tune the world we inhabit. Such ideas, you realize, could not survive unguarded. The custodians kept the atlas sealed except during specific alignments: astronomical, cultural, psychological. It was consulted rarely and never copied fully. Partial charts made their way into public knowledge, misinterpreted as errors, curiosities, or artistic flourishes. Modern astronomers sometimes stumble upon these fragments and dismiss them as mistakes, but what if they are not wrong? As your thoughts slow, the sky above you, real or imagined, feels wider, less mechanical. The stars no longer seem like distant points, but like markers in a conversation that has been ongoing longer than memory admits. You do not feel small beneath this sky, you feel included. And as sleep draws closer, the atlas closes itself, leaving you not with answers, but with a softened gaze upward, and the quiet suspicion that the universe may be paying attention too. The sky slowly folds itself away, like a great chart rolled with care, and your attention is drawn back inward, downward, again. Not into stone this time, but into something far more intimate, because the next artifact of the lost Tartarian library does not measure stars, or maps, or sound. It measures you. These are the machines that read your heart. The word machine feels wrong as soon as you think it. It suggests noise, motion, force. But the Tartarian devices were none of these. They were quiet, passive, almost shy. They did not hum unless invited. They did not activate unless approached with a certain stillness. You imagine entering a small chamber, barely larger than a cell. At its center stands a structure of interlocking materials: stone, metal, crystal, wood, arranged in a geometry that feels both natural and precise. There are no levers, no buttons, no instructions. The machine waits. According to the legend, these devices were placed at key thresholds within the library, not to test intelligence, not to test knowledge, but to sense coherence, inner consistency, emotional alignment. A mind in conflict, it is said, could not pass. The machine did not judge morality or intent. It measured rhythm, breath, subtle electrical patterns in the body, the same signals that shift when a person lies to themselves. You feel a quiet tension in this idea, not fear, but recognition. How often are your thoughts scattered? How often do desire and doubt pull in opposite directions? The Tartarian machine did not punish this. It simply reflected it back. Those who entered the chamber anxious, ambitious, or desperate found the machine inert, cold, ordinary. Nothing happened. Some left angry, convinced the legends were false. Others stayed. They breathed. They waited. They allowed the noise inside them to settle, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the device responded. Light softened, materials aligned. A pathway opened, not physically, but perceptually. The machine did not open a door. It revealed one that was already there. You understand now why these devices could never be stolen or reverse engineered. Removed from their context, they did nothing. Examined aggressively, they appeared inert. Their function depended on the participant as much as the structure. Modern science might call this biofeedback, or resonance, or quantum sensitivity. The Tartarians simply called it listening. You think of how often systems today reward agitation. Speed, urgency, dominance. How rare it is to encounter a structure that responds only to calm. Perhaps that is why the library endured. It selected not for cleverness, but for balance. The machines that read your heart ensured that no one entered the deepest chambers while divided against themselves. Not as a moral judgment, but as a safety measure. Certain knowledge, once encountered, amplifies what is already present. A fragmented mind would fracture further. As sleep wraps more closely around you, this idea feels less threatening and more kind. The library did not exclude, it waited. And you sense, with a gentle reassurance, that the machine is not asking you to be perfect, only to be whole. Once the machine falls silent again, once your inner rhythm steadies, you are guided toward a place where even sound becomes cautious. This is not a hall meant for movement or discussion. It is a pause made of stone. You are approaching the vault of breath and silence. Unlike other chambers, this one has no ornamentation, no symbols, no inscriptions. The walls are smooth, curved gently inward, as if designed to cradle rather than contain. The air feels thicker here, not stale but attentive. The Tartarians believed silence was not the absence of sound, but a medium, something that could hold, shape, and transmit meaning. This vault was built to test that belief. You step inside and immediately notice how your breath changes. Inhale feels longer, exhale softer. Each breath seems to echo inward rather than outward, as if the space itself is breathing with you. Sound does not bounce here, it dissolves. The legend says this chamber was used to prepare the mind before encountering the most volatile texts. Not because those texts were loud or frightening, but because they were subtle. Too subtle for a noisy mind. In the vault of breath and silence, even a whisper feels intrusive. You imagine standing perfectly still, listening not to the room but to yourself, thoughts slow. Sensations sharpen. Time stretches until it feels almost generous. Some who entered this vault never went further, not because they were denied, but because they realized something important. They were not ready to leave the silence. The experience itself felt complete. This, you sense, was intentional. The Tartarian library did not force progression. It allowed for stopping points, places where understanding could settle rather than escalate, places where rest was not a failure but an option. The vault was also a listening room. Custodians observed that after extended periods in this silence, visitors often spoke differently, more carefully, more honestly. Some chose not to speak at all for days afterward, not from awe, but from respect. The silence had taught them something language could not carry. You think now of how rarely modern life allows such spaces. Silence is often treated as emptiness, something to be filled. The Tartarians treated it as a resource. In this vault, breath became the only clock, the only measure of time. You could stay for minutes or hours and feel no urgency to leave. The library trusted silence to do what instruction could not. As sleep draws nearer, you feel the story itself slowing, words stretching, spaces widening between thoughts. The vault of breath and silence is not something you need to imagine fully. You are already entering it. When you finally step away from the silence, it is not with relief, but with a gentle reluctance, like leaving a warm room on a cold evening. And waiting beyond that quiet is something that feels almost tangible in its strangeness. These are the books bound in impossible materials. You had imagined leather, parchment, perhaps stone. But the Tartarian volumes defy those expectations. The legends describe bindings that feel alive without being organic, solid without being rigid, covers cool to the touch, yet softly yielding, edges that glow faintly in low light, not with brightness, but with presence. Some books are said to be bound in metals so thin and flexible they behave like skin, others in layered crystal that bends without shattering, still others in bark that pulses faintly, as if remembering the tree it once belonged to. Why go to such lengths? Because the Tartarians understood that content and container shape each other. Certain ideas corrode paper, others fracture stone. Some knowledge demands a vessel that can adapt, absorb, and recover. These bindings were not decorative, they were filters. A reader approaching one of these volumes without calm would feel discomfort, a tightening in the chest, a faint resistance in the hands. The book would not open easily, not locked, just unwilling. Those who approached gently, without hunger or demand, found the covers warm, responsive. The book would open where it needed to, not necessarily at the beginning. Sequence, again, was fluid. You realize now that the library did not organize itself by topic, but by readiness. Books did not sit patiently waiting to be chosen, they chose. This idea feels unsettling at first. It reverses control. It asks something of you rather than offering itself freely. And yet, as you sit with it, the logic becomes soothing. How many misunderstandings could be avoided if knowledge met the right mind at the right moment? The materials themselves were said to carry memory. A book handled with care grew easier to open over time. One treated roughly became heavier, duller, less responsive. The library aged with its readers. This also meant no two experiences of the same book were identical. What one person read another might never see. The text adjusted subtly, like the ink that refused to dry, reflecting not just the question asked, but the state in which it was asked. Some scholars tried to categorize these books, to rank them by importance or danger. They failed. The bindings resisted classification. Titles, if they existed at all, shifted or faded when copied. You imagine the frustration of those who sought mastery rather than relationship. How the library must have seemed hostile, even deceptive. But to those willing to listen, the books felt less like objects and more like companions, quiet, patient, exacting. As sleep presses closer, the image of these volumes softens. You no longer feel the urge to open them. You trust that if one were meant for you, it would make itself known. Perhaps that trust is part of the initiation. As your attention lingers among the strange bindings, one area of the library remains noticeably untouched. Not avoided, not sealed, simply approached with a slower pace, a deeper breath. Even in legend, this place is spoken of more quietly than the rest. This is the forbidden shelf of origins. It is not forbidden because of punishment or decree. No signs warn you away, no locks bar your path. The prohibition is softer, heavier. It comes from understanding rather than fear. You imagine the shelf set slightly apart, its volumes arranged with unusual care. Fewer books than expected, wider spaces between them, each volume resting as if in thought. These are not histories of kings or maps of land. These are accounts of beginnings, not myths, not allegories, but observations. The legend suggests these texts explored questions most civilizations answer too quickly. Where did humanity truly come from? What shaped the first minds? What agreements were made, spoken or unspoken, at the start of awareness? The Tartarians did not treat these questions as sacred mysteries beyond inquiry. They treated them as dangerous because of how easily they could be misunderstood. You feel that danger now, not as threat but as weight. To read about origins is to risk redefining identity. To alter the story of where you come from is to loosen the ground beneath everything you believe you are. The Forbidden Shelf did not hide this risk. It respected it. Some texts, it is said, described humanity not as a creation, but as a collaboration. Others suggested consciousness arrived gradually, cultivated like a crop rather than bestowed in an instant. A few hinted at external influence, not gods in the religious sense, but intelligences that interacted with early humans as gardeners rather than rulers. These ideas were not presented as conclusions, they were presented as possibilities, carefully framed, densely contextualized. Removed from that context, they could easily become justification for dominance, despair, or detachment, and so the shelf remained quiet. Readers who approached it were encouraged, never forced, to spend time in silence first, to confront their need for certainty, to notice whether they sought truth or validation. Many turned away, not because the knowledge was inaccessible, but because they realized they were not ready to carry its consequences. You understand this now. Knowledge about origins does not end with curiosity. It echoes forward, reshaping ethics, responsibility, and meaning. The Tartarian library did not ask, "Can you understand this?" It asked, "Can you live with this?" As sleep draws nearer, the forbidden shelf fades gently from view. You are not denied it. You are simply allowed to leave it for another time, and that feels kind. You step away from the forbidden shelf not with frustration, but with a strange sense of relief. Some doors, you realize, are heavy not because they resist you, but because they would change how you walk afterward. And it is here, in this softened state, that the legend introduces its most unsettling idea of all. This is the bargain with the archive. The Tartarian library, you learn, was never a gift freely taken. It was an exchange, not a transaction of value as the modern world understands it, but a rebalancing. To receive something from the archive required releasing something in return. Not money, not service, not loyalty, certainty. Those who reached the deeper chambers were asked, quietly, without ceremony, to let go of a belief they held most tightly. Sometimes it was a belief about the world, sometimes about history, often about themselves. You imagine standing before a threshold that does not block your body, only your assumptions. The archive does not demand that you agree with it. It asks only that you loosen your grip. This is why so few passed beyond this point. Certainty feels like safety. It gives shape to identity. To surrender it, even temporarily, feels like stepping into fog without a map. The Tartarians understood that knowledge added to rigid certainty becomes a weapon. Knowledge added to openness becomes wisdom. The bargain was never enforced. You could turn back at any time. Many did, carrying with them only the awareness that something vast had declined their readiness, not their worth. Those who accepted the bargain described a peculiar sensation. Not loss, but lightness, as if a clenched muscle had finally released. Memories did not vanish, opinions did not dissolve, but the emotional charge behind them softened. The archive took the edge. In return, it offered perspective. Not answers neatly packaged, but a widening of context so gentle it felt like remembering something you had always known. The bargain did not give you new beliefs. It gave you space around your existing ones. You sense how dangerous this would be to any system built on absolute narratives. A population less certain is harder to control, but also harder to mobilize for harm. Perhaps this is why the library was never meant to spread quickly. As your breathing slows, the idea of the bargain feels less threatening. You realize you release certainties all the time, when you sleep, when you dream, when you listen deeply without preparing a response. Maybe the archive is not asking for anything unnatural. Maybe it is only asking you to rest. The threshold remains open, patient, unpressured. You do not step through tonight, but you understand now what it would require, and that understanding is its own quiet gift. Once you understand the bargain, you begin to notice something you had not felt before. Not resistance, not danger, but presence. You're not alone anymore. This is when the legend speaks of the gentle shadows. They are never described as enemies, never as guards or hunters. They do not rush. They do not confront. And yet they are always there once a seeker passes a certain depth of awareness. Not ahead, not behind, just slightly to the side, like a thought you almost remember. You feel them now not as fear but as pressure, like being subtly guided away from a sharp edge. The gentle pijitus are said to appear when someone moves too quickly or carries too much certainty forward after the bargain has been offered. They are not punishments, they are corrections, a nudge rather than a wall. You imagine walking a corridor where every turn feels possible, too many possibilities in fact. The shadows thin the field, they dim certain paths, brighten others. If you insist on going the wrong way, they do not stop you. They simply make the journey slower, heavier, less interesting. Eventually most turn back on their own. The Tartarians believed that force teaches the wrong lesson. Redirection teaches patience. Some accounts describe these shadows as human, former custodians who chose to remain when the library withdrew. Others describe them as architectural effects, subtle manipulations of light and resonance that create the illusion of presence. A few suggest something stranger still, that the shadows are made from the impressions of previous seekers, echoes of intention lingering in the space. Perhaps they are all of these things at once. You sense that the library does not care which explanation you accept. It cares only that you slow down. The shadows never touch you. They never speak. And yet, when you attempt to rush toward a conclusion, about origins, about power, about revelation, you feel a soft resistance, like walking against a current that does not wish to exhaust you. This is protection disguised as inconvenience. You think of how often impatience leads people to ruin what they love. How often certainty closes doors that curiosity might have opened. The gentle shadows exist to preserve the seeker from themselves. As your thoughts drift, you realize something else. These shadows do not follow everyone. They appear only to those who might actually reach something dangerous, not because it is forbidden, but because it is unfinished. The deepest knowledge, the legend insists, is not ready to be held tightly. It is still unfolding. To seize it too early would collapse its potential. The shadows are not there to stop discovery. They are there to slow it until it ripens. You feel a strange gratitude toward them now, toward anything that has ever delayed you gently, rather than shattered you completely. The shadows thin as your breathing steadies. They do not vanish. They step back satisfied. And in that space they leave behind, you feel ready, not eager, not hungry, but receptive. With the gentle shadows receding, the space around you feels wider, calmer, almost generous. Nothing rushes you forward, nothing pulls you back. And it is in this balanced stillness that the legend allows you to reach what so many seekers imagined as an ending, but which was never meant to be one. This is the reading that changes you. Not a single book, not a final answer, not a revelation shouted from a page. Instead, it is described as an encounter, quiet, precise, and deeply personal. Those who reached this point often struggled to explain what they experienced, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was subtle in a way language resists. You imagine approaching a simple table. One book rests there, unadorned compared to the others. No glowing binding, no unusual texture. It looks almost ordinary, and perhaps that is intentional. When you open it, the pages do not rush to meet your eyes. They wait. The ink does not shimmer or move. It simply is. And yet, as you begin to read, something inside you shifts. The text does not present new information. It rearranges what you already know. Memories surface, not as scenes, but as feelings, questions you once asked and forgot you had asked, doubts you buried under confidence, hopes you dismissed as impractical. The book does not accuse, it does not praise, it reflects. This is why they say the reading blurs memory and prophecy. You begin to notice that some passages feel like recollection, even though you know you have never read them before. Others feel like anticipation, as if they are describing moments you have not yet lived. Past and future loosen their boundaries, overlapping gently, like waves meeting without collision. The Tartarians understood that time, as experienced by the human mind, is not linear. It is layered. The reading does not predict what will happen. It reveals patterns, how certain choices tend to echo, how certain states of mind invite familiar outcomes. You're not shown destiny. You're shown tendency. This distinction matters. Those who mistook the reading for prophecy often left unsettled, trying to avoid futures that were never fixed. Those who understood it as pattern left quieter, more attentive, less reactive. They recognized themselves not as passengers in time, but as participants shaping its texture. You feel that recognition now. The book does not tell you who you are. It asks you who you are becoming. And in that question, you sense the weight of responsibility. Not heavy, but real. The reading changes you not by adding belief, but by dissolving the illusion that you are separate from the flow of events. Your thoughts matter. Your pacing matters. Your willingness to pause matters. Some accounts say readers wept softly during this encounter. Not from fear or awe, but from relief, as if a long-held tension had finally been named and released. Others laughed quietly, recognizing the gentle absurdity of how seriously they had taken certain certainties. No two readings were the same, and none could be repeated. If a reader attempted to return, expecting the same insights, the book offered something entirely different, or nothing at all. The reading was not an object to be consumed. It was a moment to be lived. You begin to understand why this experience could not be spread widely. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was intimate. Mass distribution would flatten it. Context would collapse. The reading required slowness, privacy, and a willingness to remain incomplete. Modern culture, you realize, has very little patience for incompletion. As sleep presses closer, the idea of the reading becomes less sharp, more like a feeling than an image. You do not remember specific words, you remember posture, a way of holding questions without squeezing them. Perhaps that is the true change. Not knowledge gained, but urgency softened. The book closes itself gently. You do not feel dismissed. You feel finished, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of being whole for now, and you understand that whatever you have read will continue working quietly long after you leave. When the book closes, there is no applause, no signal that you have reached a conclusion. Instead, a choice settles into the space around you, calm but undeniable. The legend has been leading here all along, not toward knowledge alone, but toward responsibility. This is the choice to reveal or to bury. Those who reached this point, the Whispers say, were never commanded to act. No oath was demanded, no threat implied. The Tartarian library did not coerce, it trusted. And that trust, you sense, is heavier than any rule. You imagine standing at a quiet intersection. One path leads outward, back toward the world you know, carrying fragments of what you have experienced. The other leads deeper into forgetting, into a deliberate softening of memory, where insight remains but detail fades. Both paths are valid. Some chose to reveal, not by publishing manifestos or shouting warnings, but by embedding what they had learned into work, into design, into care. They became architects who favoured harmony over spectacle, teachers who valued curiosity over obedience, leaders who hesitated before certainty. They never mentioned the library. They didn't need to. Others chose to bury, not as suppression, but as stewardship. They recognized that the world around them was not ready to receive certain questions without turning them into weapons. So they carried their understanding quietly, allowing it to shape their choices without becoming doctrine. Neither choice was judged. The danger, the legend insists, lay only in one thing, trying to do both at once, to half reveal and half conceal, to hint dramatically without context, to provoke without preparation. This created distortion, fear, cult, obsession. The Tartarians had seen this before. You feel the wisdom of restraint settle in your chest. How often has partial knowledge caused harm? How often has certainty delivered without compassion fractured communities? The library trusted the individual to sense the moment. As you breathe, you realize this choice is not unique to the legend. You face it every day, in small ways. When to speak, when to remain silent, when to share insight, when to let someone arrive at it themselves. Perhaps the library was never separate from life. It was a mirror of it. The choice does not demand resolution tonight. It allows you to carry it forward, unanswered, shaping your awareness gently rather than urgently. You step away from the intersection, not toward either path fully, but toward rest. The choice will wait. It always does. You do not leave the library the way you entered it. There is no retracing of steps, no upward climb back through chambers and corridors. Instead, departure feels like a gradual thinning, as if the space around you loosens its hold while leaving something gently intact within you. This is the moment of leaving with one last page. It is not a physical page you carry, nothing written, nothing you could show another person and say, this is it. The Tartarian library never worked that way. What you leave with is quieter than that, softer, almost disappointing if you were expecting certainty. The final page is a clue made of absence. You realize that the greatest secret of the lost Tartarian library was never hidden in a vault, never bound in impossible materials, never guarded by machines or shadows. It was embedded in the way the library ended its encounter with you. It did not close behind you, it simply stopped insisting. You feel this now as a lightness in your thoughts. Questions remain, but they no longer press. Curiosity is still there, but it has slowed, widened, become less sharp. You're not hungry for answers, you're attentive to patterns. The last page, the legend says, was different for everyone. For some, it felt like a warning to move gently in a world addicted to speed. For others, it felt like permission to doubt without shame, to wonder without fear. And for a few, it felt like remembrance, as if something long forgotten had finally been acknowledged, even if not fully recovered. You notice how ordinary the world looks again. Streets, rooms, sounds, and yet, beneath that ordinariness, something subtle hums. You recognize it now, the same hum as the floor stones, the same quiet as the vault, the same patience as the librarian without a name. The library has not vanished. It has stepped back. Perhaps that was always the point. Knowledge does not need to dominate consciousness to shape it. It only needs to be placed carefully, allowed to settle, trusted to work slowly. You understand now why the legend never ends with revelation. Revelation excites, but it does not endure. What endures is orientation, a gentle turning of attention toward balance, restraint, listening. As you drift closer to sleep, the image of the lost Tartarian library becomes less architectural and more internal. Less a place you visited, more a way of moving through uncertainty without panic. And somewhere, Far below noise and urgency, the shelves remain aligned, the doors remain patient, and the last page remains unwritten, waiting not to be read, but to be lived. Now the story softens its edges and begins to fade just as it was always meant to do. There is nothing left to solve tonight, nothing to chase, nothing to hold tightly. The library does not require vigilance. It requires rest. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders loosen. Let the questions you gathered gently settle where they belong, not in the mind, but in the quiet space beneath thought. You do not need to remember every detail. The Tartarians understood this well. What matters will remain. What doesn't will drift away naturally, like dust returning to stillness. If the lost Tartarian library exists, it exists without urgency. It has waited through centuries of forgetting. It can wait through one more night of sleep. And if it does not exist, if it is only a story, then it has still done what all the good stories do before bedtime. It has slowed you down, it has widened your imagination, it has reminded you that not everything valuable must be seized. Some things are meant to be approached gently, some truths arrive sideways. Some answers are quieter than questions, so allow the images to dim now, let the corridors dissolve, let the final page turn itself blank and peaceful. You are you are unhurried, and nothing important is being missed.